early on in the Brothers Karamazov, we get two examples, two episodes of characters who are having a crisis of faith, and they're in very close proximity. The experience of going through a crisis of faith for real people is often a very painful experience. Think about the most difficult, agonizing decision you had to make. Think about the anxiety you might have felt. Imagine if you're anything like me, you might imagine feeling almost ill at the thought of having to come to a decision that might have a huge impact on your life, like where are you going to get an education, or how are you going to raise a child, or who are you going to marry, or something like that. Now imagine multiplying that by an incredible factor, because what's at stake in the context of a religious crisis is basically the fate of your immortal soul. It's the entire moral system that you may or may not choose to build your life upon. It might be the community that you're associated with. And so this is clearly a phenomenon that Dostoevsky is interested in. He's interested in exploring. For a person who's going through this experience, it can be very isolating, but there can also be a desire to confess, to express this inner turmoil to someone else, to share this experience with someone else. And in both these cases, there is this act of confession going on. The theme of confession is really one of the most central themes in the entire book, the Brothers Karamazov. In this part of the book, early on in the section titled Alyosha, Fyodor Karamazov is talking to Alyosha about Alyosha's decision to join a monastery and live as a monk. And Fyodor Karamazov asks that Alyosha will pray for him. Quote, "I've always been wondering who would pray for me, and whether there was anyone in the world who would do it. My dear boy, I'm awfully stupid about that. You wouldn't believe it, awfully. You see, however stupid I am about it, I keep thinking from time to time, of course, not all the while. It's impossible, I think, for the devils to forget to drag me down to hell with their hooks when I die. Then I wonder, hooks? Where will they get them? What of? Iron hooks? Where do they forge them? Have they a foundry there of some sort? The monks in the monastery probably believe there's a ceiling in hell, for instance. Now, I'm ready to believe in hell, but without a ceiling. It makes it more refined, more enlightened, more Lutheran, that is. And after all, what does it matter whether it has a ceiling or not? But do you know there's a damnable question involved in it? If there's no ceiling, there can be no hooks. And if there are no hooks, it all breaks down. Which is unlikely again, for then there would be none to drag me down to hell. And if they don't drag me down, what justice is there in the world?" End quote. And so this is a bit of a comedic scene. Fyodor Karamazov is drunk, and his idea here about do they have a foundry in hell, what hooks, is there a ceiling to hell, it all sounds a little bit ridiculous, absurd. But I think, as often happens with people who are very intoxicated, ideas that are actually coherent can come out quite mangled, quite distorted. And I think that's what's going on here. I think there's a version of what Fyodor Karamazov is saying that actually makes a lot of sense, that is a very legitimate and probably somewhat common religious crisis that people go through. And he's trying to express it, but is coming out a bit confused. And so what do I mean by that? If we look at the history of Christianity, for example, and specifically we look at the history of the conception of hell in Christianity, we see that the conception evolves over time. If we read texts from Christian thinkers, from theologians, from the time of the Middle Ages up until really the Enlightenment period in the 17th, 18th century, it's very common to find a very physical conception of hell, an idea of hell which is describing real, physical, human kind of torments. So human beings in lake of fire with all sorts of physical agonies being inflicted. With the Enlightenment, that idea became less popular, and there was more of a movement to adopt a more metaphorical conception of hell. And it's easy to understand why. With a better understanding of science, thinking of hell in very physical terms can create all sorts of interesting scientific questions. For example, like where is hell, and like what's the population of hell, and does the hell have to expand over time as more souls go into hell, and what physics do and don't apply in hell, right? Because there's like probably some physics like gravity and heat transfer and things like that, but of course human beings are not dying in hell, and you can ask interesting questions about like conservation of energy and things like that, where the sources of heat are coming from. The other big question that comes up is it a little bit petty of God to inflict physical torments on non-believers? Does that make sense philosophically speaking? And so these are questions that come up. And so what Fyodor Karamazov is saying is he's prepared to believe in hell, but only if it doesn't have a ceiling, meaning a metaphorical hell makes sense, not a physical hell. And he says it's more enlightened to have no ceiling. It's more palatable in a way, philosophically speaking. But then he wonders about the hooks, right? Because once you have no ceiling, what's left in terms of physical torment? Once hell's a metaphor, what does hell really mean? This is the question that Fyodor Karamazov is grappling with. This is the essence of his crisis. What is left for hell? He says if there's no ceiling, then there can be no hooks. And if there are no hooks, then who's going to drag me down to hell? What is the torment that awaits sinners? Not long after this, we have a scene where Father Zosima, who's one of the elders in the monastery, is greeting visitors. And one of the visitors that he greets is a woman named Madame Hochlakova, and she also makes a confession. And in this confession, I think we get a really clear, powerful description of what she's going through, how hard it is for her, and how hard it is for her to confess what she's going through. And again, I think this is psychologically realistic. For people who grew up in religion and struggle with these questions, you can't overstate how difficult these kind of crises can be in a person's life. And so Madame Hochlakova, she is now speaking to Father Zosima. Father Zosima, of course, is the figure who represents the most enlightened religious outlook, the most deeply philosophical, the most thoughtful perspective on religion in this whole book. She says to him, quote, "I have been suffering for so long. I am suffering. Forgive me, I am suffering." Father Zosima, "You are suffering? From what are you suffering?" Madame Hochlakova, "I suffer from lack of faith." Lack of faith in God? Oh, no. I dare not even think of that. But life after death, it is such an enigma, and no one can solve it. Listen, you are a healer. You are deeply versed in the human soul, and of course, I dare not expect you to believe me entirely, but I assure you, on my word of honor, that I am not speaking lightly now. The thought of life beyond the grave fills me with anguish, with terror, and I don't know to whom to appeal, and have not dared to all my life. And now I am bold enough to ask you, oh God, what will you think of me now? She again clasped her hands. Don't worry about my opinion of you, said Father Zosima. I believe in the sincerity of your suffering. Oh, how thankful I am to you. You see, I shut my eyes and I ask myself, if everyone has faith, where did it come from? They say that it all comes from terror at the menacing phenomena of nature, and that none of it is real. And I say to myself, what if I've been believing all my life, and when I come to die, there's nothing but weeds growing on my grave? I read that in a book. It's awful. How can I get back my faith? I only believed when I was a little child, mechanically, without thinking of anything. How is one to prove it? I have come now to lay my soul before you, and to ask you about it. If I let this chance slip, no one all my life will be able to give me the answer. How can I prove it? How can I convince myself? Oh, how unhappy I am. Skipping a little bit, Father Zosima answers her. No doubt, but there's no proving it, though you can be convinced of it. Madame Hochlakova, how? By the experience of active love. Strive to love your neighbor actively and constantly. Insofar as you advance in love, you will grow surer in the reality of God and of the immortality of your soul. If you attain perfect self-forgetfulness in the love of your neighbor, then you will believe without doubt. Doubt will no longer be able to enter your soul. This has been tried. This is certain. I think some philosophers might take issue with this line of reasoning. They might say it's not really a sound, coherent philosophical argument, but I think it's thought-provoking. I think it's interesting. I think it's important. And I'll leave it at that.